What if London's buried river fleet returned to the surface? Rising among the springs of Hampstead Heath in North London, the fleet once flowed openly for roughly 4 miles through the heart of the city before spilling into the Thames at Blackfriars. London's greatest lost river, it supplied drinking water and powered industry for centuries. The name Fleet comes from an Old English word for a tidal inlet broad enough to float a boat. In Roman times, the river's lower reaches formed the western boundary of Londinium, serving as a navigable route into the settlement and crossed by one of the city's earliest bridges. The springs around its valley were once praised as sweet, clear, and salubrious. But as London expanded, the Fleet became clogged with rubbish, sewage, and waste from slaughterhouses and tanneries. By the medieval period, Londoners were already complaining about its overpowering stench downriver. After the Great Fire of 1666, the lower reaches were transformed into an elegant canal. But the upgrade ended up failing miserably, and the river eventually reverted to an open sewer. From 1733, the Fleet began disappearing beneath streets and markets, with the final open northern sections covered over during the late 19th century. Today, most Londoners cross the river without ever knowing it is there. But in this alternate reality, the Fleet has been brought back to life. Using cutting-edge AI visualization, guided by old maps, historic images, and written accounts, we can now follow the revived river along its entire course in photorealistic detail, offering a tantalizing glimpse of how the Fleet might look flowing through London today. The river's course changed considerably over time as its streams were dammed, diverted, and eventually enclosed. The route followed here is therefore a plausible reconstruction rather than a precise snapshot of the river at one exact date. Our journey downriver begins high on Hampstead Heath, at the source of the Western or Hampstead branch. This branch of the river rises in the Vale of Health, a once marshy hollow close to the summit of the heath, around 130 metres above sea level. Its ultimate source is remarkably modest, basically a tiny spring-fed trickle emerging among the trees. The hollow was previously known by the decidedly less genteel name of Hatchett's Bottom. In 1777, its boggy ground was drained, and one of the Fleet's headwater streams was dammed to form a reservoir. Fine houses and villas began to appear, and the neighbourhood underwent a remarkable rebrand. By the beginning of the 19th century, Hatchett's Bottom had become the chic and prestigious Vale of Health. John Constable captured the reservoir in the 1820s, with a swish Vale of Health hamlet behind. From here, the western headwaters also feed the Hampstead Ponds. On the opposite side of Parliament Hill, the Fleet's eastern or Highgate branch rises just southwest of Kenwood House. It then flows through the Highgate Ponds. Both pond chains were created by damming the small streams that descended from the heath. In this alternate reality, these artificial reservoirs are either reduced or bypassed entirely to restore the natural, free-flowing course of the infant river. Leaving the heath proper, the western branch enters the shallow valley now followed by Southend Road. Parliament Hill rises to the east, while the higher ground towards Haverstock Hill lies to the west, naturally funneling the river south. Still close to its headwaters, the daylighted river takes the form of a naturalised stream, meandering through a soft planted channel while being discreetly engineered to manage flooding and protect the surrounding streets. From Southend Road, the babbling brook continues towards Southend Green, where in this alternate reality, a lost piece of Hampstead's watery landscape has been meticulously restored. But before reaching this landmark feature, the fleet would have to cross the deep railway cutting at Hampstead Heath station. It could either disappear briefly into an enclosed conduit built into the Southend Road Bridge, or remain visible in a narrow open flume carried above the tracks. Today, Southend Green is a busy road junction dominated by the Royal Free. But the name of Pond Street, which climbs uphill beside the hospital, tells us what once occupied the green. While the Upper Heath reservoirs are reduced or bypassed entirely to let the river run free, this historic lower basin is brought back as a vibrant urban focal point. This old engraving portrays it as a still and self-contained basin, but the original pond was actually fed and drained by the Hampstead branch of the river. By the 19th century, it had deteriorated from a popular rural amenity into a public nuisance. The river's flow had reduced and the water quality had declined, while the pond itself was seen as hampering Hampstead's expanding road network. In 1835, Old Hampstead Pond was filled in. The site then became Southend Green, with a neo-Gothic drinking fountain added in 1880. Here, the restored pond takes the form of a gentle, steep sequence of water. Rather than recreating the stark, railed pond shown in the historic image, this is a modern interpretation of the same lost feature. Soft planting, shallow margins, and wetland vegetation provide space for wildlife, while the tiered design helps store stormwater and manage the change in level through the junction. On the left is the aptly named Fleet Tavern, which was recently rechristened to pay homage to the lost river. Known for years as the White Horse, a pub has stood in the same spot since 1721. Having nestled beside the open river for much of its early history, the pub regains its riverside setting in this alternate reality. Leaving Southend Green, the river follows the road that still bears its name. Fleet Road developed from an old lane running beside the water. Parts of its lower end began to be built up from around 1850, as this stretch of the Fleet was gradually culverted. The terrace on the left dates from the mid-19th century and follows the distinctive curve of the old lane and stream. In our reimagined London, Fleet Road becomes the Fleet River once again. The carriageway gives way to a narrow, naturalised channel with planted banks for flood mitigation, pedestrian paths, and a small bridge connecting the two sides. Still relatively close to its headwaters, the Fleet remains modest in scale as it skirts the Victorian buildings. Incidentally, next to the old chapel on the right is the Beehive, the former church hall that Coldplay converted into their recording and rehearsal studio in 2010. South of here, the Hampstead branch turns northeast along Mansfield Road towards Gospel Oak, before turning southeast and meandering through the western side of Kentish Town. Despite the name, Kentish Town has nothing to do with the county of Kent. One theory states it derives from Ken Ditch or Cain Ditch, meaning green ditch and referring to the Fleet. Another theory connects it with the settlement's position between the river's two branches. What is certain though is that the river is clearly woven into the area's identity. Kentish Town began as a small settlement between these two streams, with the Hampstead branch flowing down its western edge and the Highgate branch to the east. But both branches were buried in the area during the 1850s and 1860s. The two branches met here at the junction of Hawley Road and Kentish Town Road. These days, it's a broad expanse of traffic and tarmac, overlooked by Quinn's Irish pub. But with the fleet restored, the junction becomes an idyllic riverside public space, crossed by a gently arched bridge, while Quinn's gains a waterside terrace. Flooding was a serious problem in this location. In 1826, just south of this spot, the fleet reportedly grew to 20 metres wide. So the deep, broad, planted banks in this vision are not merely decorative. They give the river room to expand during heavy rain, while the lower terraces and wetland planting provide extra flood storage and help slow the river before it continues downstream. From this point onwards, the fleet becomes broader, carrying the combined waters of its Hampstead and Highgate branches south. The fleet then meets another of London's waterways, the Regent's Canal. Opened in 1820, the canal was built across the river's path, with the fleet carried beneath it through a tunnel. Even in this restored landscape, the river briefly disappears underground here, before returning to the surface near Camden Sainsbury's and flowing southeast to our next port of call, Old St Pancras Church. A place of worship has stood here since at least the Saxon period, and possibly earlier. The church is dedicated to St Pancras, a young Roman martyr said to have died in AD 304. The building shown in these old views is not quite the church we see today, which was largely rebuilt in 1847. The structure occupies a small natural rise known as Church Hill. Around it lies the much flatter St Pancras Wash, part of the fleet's floodplain. The river ran directly below the churchyard, and although normally only a few metres wide, it could swell dramatically here after heavy rain. Just south of the hill was St Pancras Wells. First recorded in the late 17th century, it developed into a fashionable spa with pump rooms, pleasure gardens and a house of entertainment. But by the end of the 18th century, the wells had largely been forgotten, and the site later disappeared beneath railway development. The fleet itself was covered here in the 1770s, unusually early compared with other higher sections of the river. But brought back into the open, it once again flows beneath the raised churchyard, crossed by a footbridge at the entrance. Given the river is especially susceptible to flooding here, the banks are deep and accommodating. In normal weather, the fleet would run well below the surrounding ground, leaving plenty of spare capacity. After prolonged rain, the water level would rise dramatically while remaining contained within the channel. From Old St Pancras, the fleet continues south into King's Cross, following one of the strangest bends along its entire course. The river swings east, then south, and back west, passing directly in front of the German gymnasium before turning south again. Long before the railway stations arrived, this area was known as Battle Bridge. Tradition linked it to Boudicca's final battle with the Romans, though there's little evidence that the showdown happened here. The name in fact probably evolved from Bradeford or Broadford, referring to an ancient crossing of the fleet. The name King's Cross came much later, from a much derided monument to George IV erected nearby in the 1830s. Built in 1864 and 1865, the German Gymnasium was London's first purpose-built gym, so named since it was constructed for the German Gymnastic Society. The venue hosted events during the first National Olympian Games of 1866, an important forerunner of the modern Olympics. Today, the gymnasium survives as a restaurant. The restored Fleet now takes the form of a canalised, open river. The waterway's softer banks have given way to stone walls as it winds through King's Cross. The surrounding riverside paths and terraces echo the revamped Regent's Canal waterfront at nearby Granary Square. After passing the German Gymnasium, the Fleet curls around King's Cross Station. The river remained open here much later than it did beside Old St Pancras, finally disappearing underground during the huge railway developments of the mid-19th century. One of the clearest clues to the Fleet's route survives in the Great Northern Hotel. Designed by Lewis Cubitt and opened in 1854, the building follows the sweeping curve of the old Pancras Place, an alignment that follows the river's exact course. With the Fleet brought back to the surface, the shape of the hotel makes perfect sense. Leaving King's Cross, the Fleet turns southeast and runs roughly parallel to King's Cross Road. This was the part of its course where it was often known as the River of Wells, fed by a string of natural springs. One of them was St Chad's Well, remembered today by St Chad's Place. During the 18th century, Londoners came here in large numbers to enjoy its mineral-rich water, which was believed to cure a wide range of ailments. A bit further south stood Bagnigge Wells House and Gardens. Opened to the public in 1758, it became one of Georgian London's most popular spas and pleasure gardens. Visitors drank the iron-rich and purgative waters, took tea, listened to music, and enjoyed leisurely strolls through gardens divided by the Fleet, with small bridges joining the two banks. The low-lying district was known as Bagnigge Wash, and like other parts of the river, remained highly vulnerable to flooding. Nearby was another spring known as Black Mary's Hole. The origin of the name has been obscured by contradictory stories, but an account from 1828 explains the well was leased by Mary Wollaston, a black woman who earned a living selling its water during the 17th century. Other origin stories connect the name with a pre-Reformation Black Madonna statue linked to a local nunnery, and a tale about a woman who kept a black cow and sold its milk mixed with spring water as a restorative tonic. With London closing in, the spas declined, and Bagnigge Wells finally disappeared in the 1840s. Yet the shape of the old river valley can still be seen in the dip in today's Calthorpe Community Garden and in the uneven levels of the surrounding streets. At Calthorpe Street, the road once crossed the Fleet on a bridge. With the river restored, the canalised channel veers west through the old valley before continuing south towards Mount Pleasant. This part of the river was extensively altered in the early 19th century, when its winding course was diverted into enormous brick sewers and new streets were laid above it. So the waterway shown here revives the earlier open river while adapting its level to fit into the modern urban layout. From Calthorpe Street, the Fleet crosses the site now occupied by the Mount Pleasant Mall Centre, before emerging near where Phoenix Place meets Mount Pleasant. The Fleet was once joined here by smaller tributaries, including one rising around today's Queen Square, whose waters were later tapped by the land's conduit. This low-lying district was once known as Coldbath Fields, after a medicinal spring and bathing establishment nearby. The riverbank later became a dumping ground, and Mount Pleasant no doubt acquired its ironic name from the enormous mound of ashes and rubbish that accumulated here. Between 1788 and 1794, part of the former dumping ground was cleared to make way for the Middlesex House of Correction, better known as Coldbath Fields Prison. The jail was notorious for its harsh regime, including Treadwell labour that prisoners called grinding the wind. After the prison closed in 1885, the post office took over the site, developing it into Mount Pleasant, one of London's principal postal centres. Today, the Fleet passes unseen beneath the depot and Phoenix Place. With the river restored, Mount Pleasant once again becomes a crossing, while the existing paved space beside it gains a new life as a waterside terrace. From Mount Pleasant, the Fleet continues down Warner Street before turning across Ray Street, running along the foot of Back Hill. Even today, the Fleet is not completely hidden. Through a pavement grating outside the coach pub, you can sometimes hear the Fleet rushing through the sewer below, making this one of the few places where London's greatest lost river can still be experienced directly. The low ground around the pub was once known as Hockley in the Hole. It occupied the river's north bank, roughly around the coach and the space directly in front of us. By the early 18th century, Hockley had become infamous for gambling, prize fights, cockfighting, and bear and bull baiting. A bear garden, not a beer garden, stood beside an earlier tavern on the site of the coach, and in 1709, its proprietor was reportedly killed by one of its own beasts. The dodgy locale's reputation became so dreadful that it was officially renamed Ray Street in 1774. The steep rise of Back Hill is another surviving trace of the old Fleet Valley. From the 1830s, the surrounding streets became a little Italy, home to generations of Italian migrants. With the Fleet brought back into the open, the road gives way to a canalised bend. The coach returns to the riverbank, while the sudden climb up Back Hill is recognisable again as the side of the river valley. From Ray Street, the Fleet veers southeast into the line now followed by Farringdon Road. To the east is Clerkenwell, christened after the nearby Clarkswell, where London's parish clerks once gathered to perform religious plays. Immediately to the east is Turnmill Street. It was named after the watermills once powered by the river, and centuries later became home to the legendary Turnmills nightclub. In this part of its course, the Fleet was commonly known as Turnmill Brook. Now we've arrived at the junction of Cowcross Street and Farringdon Road. Rising ahead is Saffron Hill, which climbs steeply out of the Fleet Valley. Its name comes from the saffron once grown in the gardens of the bishops of Ely, whose estate occupied the higher ground. With the Fleet restored, the bridge shown here revives the historic cow bridge, used by cattle being driven towards the livestock market at nearby Smithfield, now the home of London Museum, formerly the Museum of London. Cowcross Street preserves the memory of that bridge. Continuing south, the Fleet enters the deep valley below Holborn. The area's name comes from the Holborn, meaning the stream in the hollow, a reference to the river running through this natural cleft in the landscape, with the name's pronunciation compressed over the centuries to Holborn. Along the western bank ran Chick Lane, later renamed West Street. By the 18th century, it had become a cramped and incredibly dicey neighbourhood, with decaying houses, workshops and sheds crowding over the Fleet ditch. The sprawling Red Lion was the area's most notorious establishment. Once a tavern, it later became a squalid lodging house and the perfect hiding place for criminals. This image from 1844 shows the Fleet flowing directly behind it, shortly before the complex was demolished. By this point, the river bore little resemblance to the clear stream that had risen on Hampstead Heath. Hemmed in by walls and buildings, with much of its water drawn off, it had become a narrow, filthy channel running through one of London's poorest districts. At the bottom of the valley stood Holborn Bridge, carrying the road between the steep slopes of Holborn Hill and Snow Hill. Although the fleet was already underground here by the Victorian period, the valley it had carved remained a major obstacle. Holborn Viaduct was built between 1863 and 1869 to carry the road high above Farringdon Street, avoiding the awkward descent and climb on either side. Its ornate iron spans, granite piers, statues and winged lions turned a piece of road engineering into one of the city's grandest gateways. With the fleet restored and its natural flow replenished, the viaduct becomes a true river crossing. The canalised waterway passes beneath its arches, while narrow walks follow the banks through the Fleet Valley. From Holborn Viaduct, the fleet continues south to Ludgate Circus, where the Fleet Bridge, one of London's oldest east-west routes, crossed the river. Among the river's most disgusting stretches, the part between Holborn Bridge and Fleet Bridge was covered from as early as 1733, with the Fleet Market opening above it. The meat and vegetable market survived into the late 1820s, when it was swept away to create Farringdon Street. To the west of Ludgate Circus is Fleet Street, named after the waterway and long synonymous with the press. To the east, Ludgate Hill climbs towards St Paul's Cathedral and the site of Ludgate itself, the western gateway into the Old City. The ancient Fleet Bridge, which was first recorded in the 12th century, was one of the busiest crossings between the city and Westminster. Southeast of the bridge stood the fearsome Fleet Prison. It was mainly used for debtors and became a hotbed of corruption, appalling conditions, and the clandestine weddings known as Fleet marriages. It finally closed in 1842 and was demolished 4 years later. On the opposite bank stood Bridewell Palace. Developed from 1515 for Henry VIII as a royal residence, it was the setting of the iconic Ambassador's painting by Hans Holbein, which dates from 1533. The palace was later handed to the city and converted into a hospital, workhouse and prison. The jail's reputation was so enduring that Bridewell became a general term for a house of correction. The relative abundance of prisons along the Fleet partly came about due to its propensity to flooding and terrible stench. With the riverbanks considered undesirable to say the least, they basically became home to institutions London preferred to keep at a distance. With the fleet restored, Ludgate Circus returns to its past life as a river crossing. The broad bridge is raised above the canalised waterway, maintaining the historic link between Fleet Street and Ludgate Hill. But this is also where the practical difficulties of daylighting the river become impossible to ignore. In 2008, advisors to the then London Mayor, Boris Johnson, floated the idea of reopening short ornamental stretches of the city's buried rivers. Restoring selected sections of the Fleet could create greener public spaces, improve biodiversity, contribute to urban cooling, and provide extra capacity for heavy rainfall, which would come in very handy as global warming intensifies. Reopening the river, however, would mean rebuilding a disjointed sewer route through roads, railways, utilities, and some of the most densely developed land in London. It would be a ridiculously complex engineering nightmare, and the cost would likely be astronomical. And that's before considering years of disruption, compulsory purchases, and political resistance, not to mention objections from residents, businesses, and landowners along the route. A wholesale revival is therefore exceedingly unlikely, while daylighting even compact sections upstream would present enormous difficulties, but we can, of course, dream. From Ludgate Circus, the fleet runs south for its last short stretch to the Thames. On the east bank, near the river's mouth, stood the first Baynard's Castle, a Norman stronghold built close to the southwest corner of the city wall. After that site was sold to the Blackfriars in 1275, its owners built a second castle further east along the Thames. Henry VII later transformed that second site into a great Tudor palace, which remained associated with royal and noble power until it was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1666. After the Great Fire, there were ambitious plans to overhaul the river, most notably the late 17th century improvement project associated with Robert Hooke and Christopher Wren. The project transformed the lower river into a formal canal with quays and stone sides. On paper, it promised a bustling industrial highway to drum up the city's trade and economy. In reality, the scheme was a massive failure. The fleet remained tidal, silted up badly, and soon became too foul and impractical for the elegant mercantile canal its promoters had imagined. This is worth bearing in mind when looking at this 18th century painting by Samuel Scott, which presents the Lower Fleet as a busy, picturesque waterway. Like many topographical artists, Scott idealised the scene. The river was never as clean or idyllic as he made it appear. The picture shows Fleet Bridge apparently much closer to the Thames than it would be today. That's not just artistic licence, however. In the mid-18th century, this whole waterfront was still pre-embankment. Later embanking pushed the river wall further out, narrowing the Thames and altering the relationship between the old Fleet mouth and the main river. The Lower Fleet was covered in the 1760s during the construction of the original Blackfriars Bridge, and was later absorbed into Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system. Its historic connection to the Thames survives at Blackfriars as the Fleet combined sewer outfall. The Tideway Works have since installed a vast culvert and interception system beneath the suitably named Bazalgette Embankment, diverting most storm overflows into the Thames Tideway Tunnel rather than allowing them to spill directly into the river. With the Fleet restored, this last reach would once again read as a true river mouth, a tidal channel slipping out between the dense layers of the city and into the Thames. The final stretch is shown here flowing into the Thames under a companion span to the existing Blackfriars Road and rail bridges. Sadly, the chances of the Fleet ever being restored, even in part, are very slim indeed. But tracing its course shows the river is not really gone. It may now be subterranean, but the waterway has shaped streets, hills, bridges and neighbourhoods all the way across London. From the ponds of Hampstead Heath to the Thames at Blackfriars, the Fleet remains written into the landscape, hidden in plain sight, a ghost river that truly left its mark on London's geography and history.